So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here and welcome to our online audience too. So we are streaming it online and we are very delighted. So my name is Avasha and I am Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center. And this is Eye on Africa, which is our weekly seminary series. So every Thursday, we have a guest speaker to tell us about the research in relation to Africa. So today we are very, very delighted to have Dr. Avasha Rambiritch as our guest speaker. She's visiting us from South Africa. So welcome. We're very delighted to have you. And before I pass it on to her, a brief introduction. So Dr. Rambiritch is a senior lecturer in the Unit for Academic Literacy at the University of Pretoria, where she teaches academic literacy and academic writing models at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. She is also the coordinator for the Writing Center. Her research interests include academic writing, writing centers, and social justice, as well as language testing. She is an associate of Inter-Institutional Center for Language Development and Assessment, a partnership of 4 multilingual South African universities, and also the NExLA, I think it's Network for Expertise in Language Testing, a member of the South African Association of Language Teachers and co-founder of the South African Association of Academic Literacy Practitioners. She has published research articles in accredited journals and has co-edited a soon-to-be-published book on South African Writing Center. She is also the assistant editor of the South African Journal for Language Teaching. And I also want to thank you very much, the Writing Center, because we organize this in collaboration with the Writing Center here at MSU. So thank you, Grace and Emily? Trixie, thank you, sorry. So thank you very much, Emily and Trixie. So we collaborated before, so this is the second time we're working together and to bringing speakers to the Eye on Africa series. So a warm welcome to Dr. Avasha Rambiritch, everybody. And I pass it on to you.
Yet much of our research, like our counterparts internationally, lament our underfunded, understaffed, and marginalized status. This is not to say that all writing center research wallows in such lamentations, but that much research as a prelude positions the writing center. Now, my aim here is not to undermine the reality of our struggles, for as a writing center coordinator myself, I am more than familiar with exactly this. My aim here is to propose a possible reimagining of our space, to one not defined by our marginalization, but by the resilience, flexibility, and commitment that present-day writing center work demonstrates. In research for an earlier paper focused on space and safety in the South African Writing Center, I found myself drawn to what would be considered a more than slightly unpopular opinion. In personal communication to Sunstain, Joan Mullen shares her view that, and I quote, "For once and for all, I'd like to erase the image of marginality that lurks in writing centers past and which still exist in some of our present. Similar to a language termed woundology, the term allows us to continue mourning over our position, our loss of voice, our loss of budget from a disadvantageous academic space. Such history and the mentality it breeds deserves to be reinvented. For our marginality has not led to our failed budgets or support, nor has it contributed to our successes. We have always been off our institutions. We have always been within them," unquote. So the question that I would like to ask, and to echo Joan Mullen's words, how do we reinvent or reimagine ourselves? For we are of our institutions and within them. South African Writing Center practitioners have long grappled with the notion of reimagining, rejecting notions of the Writing Center as home, offering in our thinking and practices like Aro and Clemens, the Writing Center as a brave place. Today, I would like to propose a slightly alternate rendering of the reimagining, a call to perhaps turn the lenses inward to our daily practices within our own spaces that should ideally impact the support we provide. Babcock and Tonis open their book with the following quote from Bouquet, and I quote, "If Darwin were to teach us anything about writing centers, he would probably urge us to adopt a materialist mode, complete with rich, thick descriptions of our own pedagogical Galapagos, out of which patterns and revelations will emerge. He would tell us to write them down, not lock them away in a desk and wait for the world to catch up. We must relinquish our faith, stop believing in writing centers, and start convincing ourselves and others by the evidence," unquote. It is the rich, thick descriptions I am interested in, the need to write them down, to stop believing in writing centers, and start convincing ourselves and others by the evidence. It is the evidence I'm interested in, the evidence that should guide and inform our practices. It is the research that I'm interested in, the diligent and systematic inquiry or investigation into a subject in order to revise facts, theories, or applications. Thus, I want to propose a reimagined South African Writing Center, one immersed in sound research practice and crafted from diligent or systematic inquiry, that work locally but envision broadly, that see research as a continuing conversation of multiple voices, multiple contexts, and multiple realities. In keeping with this, I would like to use this platform to demonstrate the necessity for and value of context-specific, evidence-based practices in crafting a truly South African Writing Center by presenting one Writing Center's response to two key issues. The first, supporting an increasingly multilingual student body, and the second, transforming our training practices by embracing a research praxis. I have long believed that the Writing Center is mirror to the world and cannot remain stoic as the outside world metamorphosizes in multiple ways. In fact, change is occurring rapidly, incessantly, or according to Seifman and Fort-Hom, at warp speed, which I have just learned is a phrase that has entered public consciousness through science fiction, popularized by Star Wars. So change occurs faster than we can imagine. In light of this, the additional need to grow and develop a global student, and the changing face and internationalization of our student body, it is imperative to foreground both the strides made in the field, as well as the important questions and debates confronting Writing Center practitioners in the South African higher education arena. The latter demands that we review and reimagine the support we currently provide. Reimagining, however, forces us to wrestle with the challenges inherent in work of this nature and to be vocal about the difficult questions that must be asked and answered if we want to present socially just solutions to our students' writing challenges. As Writing Center practitioners on the international front grapple with important questions, our Writing Center community too must raise their voices as we seek answers to the burning questions we confront. So in a world constantly in flux, and with a student body so beautifully unique, yet challenged on so many fronts, what is the responsibility of the present-day Writing Center? How must the South African Writing Center reimagine itself to effectively support our students for a future we cannot yet imagine? How do we craft a truly South African Writing Center? Before I delve into this first part of my paper, it is imperative to acknowledge that South African writing centers willingly adopted the idea of a writing center from the US context. And for much of our short writing center history, we have relied aggressively on the constructs, philosophies, and practices of our US writing center counterparts, drawing from their literature and experience. But as writing centers evolved and transformed, practitioners quickly realized the perils of adopting practices from a context different from ours. In interrogating the context-specific needs of our cohort, we were forced to confess too that writing center law and dogma had been so firmly entrenched in our minds that we felt guilt and frustration when we used strategies that transgressed those in the literature. Called to action by such frustration and the realization that we cannot and should not apply one-size-fits-all solutions in our writing center, South African writing center practitioners investigate and apply solutions that speak to the lived reality of our students. Thus, while we have learned that there is much value in drawing from different contexts, as this contributes to the richness of our knowledge and experience and allows us to view our practices through multiple lenses, we realize too the urgency to craft a South African writing center. South African writing centers developed out of a need to undo injustices effected during apartheid. As we proceeded to investigate the support our students need, writing center practitioners were forced to acknowledge that that support, whatever shape or form it took, could not be divorced from the rapid changes being effected outside of the writing center. 29 years after democracy, English retains its hegemony as a language of influence, means, and access in all spheres of life. We are a multilingual country with monolingual practices. Ironically, South Africa has one of the most diverse and accommodating language policies in the world, with 12 official languages and a significant number of minority languages. Despite the large number of official languages, English is the dominant language in South Africa. Following suit, institutions of higher education have remained predominantly monolingual. Fittingly, a colleague at a national language audit recently contended, tongue-in-cheek, that South African higher education institutions have very successfully transformed into monolingual institutions. Despite a South African constitution which stipulates that the state, in recognizing the historically diminished use and status of the indigenous languages of our people, must take practical and positive measures to elevate the status and advance the use of these languages. Today, language policies at many institutions of higher education create barriers to effective teaching and learning and erode affirmation of African culture by its implicit placing of English as the main unifying neutral language. Our stance in response to this is one that coheres with ambiguous contention that ideologies about language are an integral part of ideologies in other domains of human activity, such as the creation of language policy. We are fully aware too of the pedagogical and cognitive benefits of a multilingual education, and there is much research to support this notion. Writing centers have responded deftly to the need to develop the multilingual repertoire of our students, and South African writing centers have responded equally evocatively. Operating in largely monolingual institutions and acting as activists and advocates for our students, South African writing centers were quick to act on the social justice principles of distribution, recognition, and representation, acknowledging that overcoming injustice means dismantling institutionalized obstacles that prevent some people on power from participating as full partners in social interaction. This is crucial in a country whose history is steeped in injustice, the marginalization of indigenous languages, and spatial injustice, all of which have been the defining elements of a system that has ravaged generations. Archer appealed for South African writing centers to approach their work from an academic literacies perspective, which, it was argued, has an epistemology of literacy as social practice and a transformative ideology. Nichols shared how in a feedback session of a writing intensive initiative for social first-year students, students wept as they explained to their writing fellow that the assumption that their home languages and cultures had no connection to the cast iron institutional requirement of standard academic English. Her warning is that writing centers should sooner rather than later employ a pedagogy of transition and transformation. Daniels and Richards see the writing lab as a contact zone, a space where different languages and cultures merge, where issues of language equity and language quality must be confronted to enable members to participate fully in the activities of the writing lab. Bailey undertook a critical ethnographic study with students, tutors, and administrators at a South African university with the aim of understanding the experiences of students and tutors in a multilingual writing center. Underpinned by theories of social justice, Ubuntu, and language ideology, the study found that multilingual students feel comfortable with particular students, with particular tutors who speak their home language, and they seek these tutors for appointments. Students and tutors revealed satisfaction with the experience of the multilingual lab. Tutors stated that their own language skills have improved as a result of working with students in multiple languages. And most tutors working in the lab are also actively studying another language or have expressed a desire to do so. In embracing multilingual practices, one of the largest public universities in South Africa recently embarked on a multilingual research project funded by an external grant, where multiple avenues are being explored. In the first research emanating from this project, the researchers investigated Writing Center consultants' perspective on the possible transformation of the Writing Center. It drew on concepts of multilingualism and Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy to understand, through the voices of consultants, how multilingual practices in the Writing Center can contribute to addressing the academic writing challenges of students and feelings of exclusion at a South African university. As the discussion evolved and the idea of a multilingual writing center was offered, consultants were positive and optimistic, but also honest and forthcoming about their concerns, which included how a multilingual writing center would impact on their competencies, that we may not always be equipped to deal with everyone's particular language, and of course the ever-present concern with inadequate resources. Strengths they mentioned, including building rapport, better understanding, and most significantly, that students can finally take back their power and political will. As a second part to the study, we aim to determine what the uptake would be for multilingual consultations and what actually occurs during such consultations. We were surprised to find that while students indicated a willingness to consult with a consultant with whom they shared a language, they were not keen to conduct the entire or parts of the consultation in their first language. In an effort to encourage the use of the first language during the consultation, the consultant began the consultation by inviting the use of the first language and used the first language. Doing so invited a wonderful opportunity for translanguaging. Exploratory analysis in this very early stage of the project shows that the student and the consultant used translanguaging for the following aspects: to talk about admin and management of the consultation and the writing center, to talk about content, language, structure, style, and there are elements of politeness and small talk as well. This preliminary analysis will pave the way for more thorough analysis of video-recorded multilingual consultations and will allow us to investigate how best to support our specific context. Our early research findings demonstrate a hesitancy on the part of the student to fully embrace multilingualism during consultations. The overall monolingual bias of the institution could be the underlying reason for this. The fact that students write in English too may presuppose their desire to write in English or to communicate in English. And of course, the privileging of English as a language of international communication means that English currency is valuable and sought after. And the Writing Center could present the ideal space to practice your English without fear of reprisal. Our Writing Center, however, is committed to the holistic development of the students visiting us. Our responsibility is to continue with our context-specific research and devise the most appropriate strategies for our students. In earlier, similar, video-recorded research focused on determining the strategies our consultants were exploiting during Writing Center consultations, we discovered that one consultant in particular was using a novel, at least in our context, an engaging way to support students. This discovery, now captured in a book chapter entitled Bridging the Multilingual Divide, Enhancing Academic Literacy Through Metaphors in South African Writing, captures one consultant's attempt to bridge the gap between student and consultant using metaphors. She writes, and I quote, "I'm a context-specific consultant. Being older, white, and a go-go, which is a grandmother, I face the challenge of establishing common ground with much younger students from different backgrounds. Rejecting the notion of a generation gap, I believed in the responsibility of the older generation to bridge divides. As a solution, I turned to figures of speech, particularly metaphors, when conventional teaching methods fell short," unquote. This most compelling research demonstrates that the use of cultural specific metaphors, as well as more commonly known metaphors, did transcend the language barrier, but also the possible power imbalance between an older white female consultant and a much younger African student. The detailed analysis showed that the student understood the abstract academic concepts that were unfamiliar at the beginning, and that linking these new abstract concepts to something enjoyable in their lives made them reconsider their apprehension of being able to apply this new knowledge. Thus, the researcher contends that context-specific metaphors can be used during Writing Center consultations to bridge the linguistic and cultural divide, but also to support the transfer of academic literacy skills. The need for such studies that provide sound evidence that validates our practices and existence is crucial. Thompson et al. Wrote that in their rapid growth in the 1970s and 1980s, writing centers came to depend on law, which Stephen North defines as knowledge about what to do, based on practice and inherited from one generation of practitioners from the previous one. This law has been codified as cherished beliefs or defaults. As we embrace the transformation of the present-day writing center, we cannot still shroud the work we do in the language of law. Writing center practitioners, in especially the South African context, must commit themselves to sound, thorough, evidence-based practices that demonstrate our commitment to our students and to our practices, but also to our desire to develop fully a body of South African Writing Center literature that captures the rigor of our research practices. Now, as I approach the second part of my paper, and in keeping with its focus, I would like to demonstrate, albeit briefly, how evidence-based practices are informing our response to consultant training. TONUS, In the opening address to the first National Colloquium on Writing Center Consultant Training in South Africa in 2019 stated, and I quote, "In this paper, you'll notice that I refer to Writing Center research and tutor training in the same breath. That's because they are and must always be connected and even intertwined. Research informs our training and training and practice inform research. That's the only way to get beyond this is what we do in our writing center to some sort of consensus about best practices, be they local, national, or global," unquote. We acknowledge that the Writing Center, which should no longer operate on the periphery of institutions, has a crucial role to play in supporting students as they find their way in academia. But such support must take cognizance of the needs of a diverse and multifaceted student body, as has been demonstrated. While international literature can support what and how we train our consultants, South African Writing Center practitioners must continue to interrogate our practices through constructive dialogue and debate in the hope of producing a framework or heuristic that can effectively support the work we do. While writing centers were established to support the mass entry of and underprepared students entering higher education post-democracy, the student body of today differs largely from that earlier cohort. Today, higher education institutions have become a teaching and learning space that welcomes an international student body as border and international lines melt away. Thus, today, we can think of the South African Writing Center as a global village, the proverbial melting pot, a colorful tapestry of tongues, histories, and nationalities, where multiple cultures, languages, beliefs, ethnicities, races, and colors work collaboratively to the same end, the academic success of our students. In light of the ever-fluid nature of our student body and our pledge to support our students in their quest to academic success, our support and the practices that inform such support must speak to the context needs of our students. For a large part of South African Writing Center history, Writing Center practitioners have relied heavily on the literature emanating from the global north. As a relatively new and inexperienced Writing Center coordinator nearly 9 years ago, I too turned to similar literature, much of which served me well and sustained my practices. Like other practitioners, Harris, Olson, North, Bruffy, Brooks, and others helped establish the center and became the basis of my practices. But it was not long before NExLA's thought-provoking text confirmed some of my concerns and stimulated my thinking. What we needed was a guide to effectively train our tutors and support the newer cohort of students entering our doors. South African universities do not offer formal credit-bearing or non-credit-bearing peer tutoring courses. Writing Center coordinators and directors are thus fully responsible for the training of our consultants and tutors. What I offer is gleaned from my limited experience in coordinating a writing center and by extension, training consultants. In keeping with the imperative for sound, evidence-based practices, the outline proposed draws deeply from the research conducted in our writing center. The intention is not to provide a blueprint for such training, but to perhaps offer a living framework or outline that can, through dialogue and interrogation by writing center practitioners, evolve into a useful foundation to guide future training. The topics covered are by no means exhaustive, and I am aware too of a number of equally important topics that need inclusion. So I'm going to talk a bit to my presentation at last. And what I've tried to do is tabulate much of the research into 4 meaningful columns. The first deals with the topics that we think would be important in tutor training. The second, the international guides or the research that we've relied on or that have informed our practices and our research. The third column is the context-specific research conducted within our center. And the last column looks at the implications for tutor training. I must state that when we established the Writing Center, we realized that the consultants are the lifeblood of that center. And if we want to effectively support our students, it starts with effective training. So whatever research we conducted on the Writing Center, our conclusion to that research speaks directly to implications for tutor training. And I love that we started off our very early research with the theories underpinning Writing Center practices. And in writing up that research, we were, of course, guided by Foster and Quinn, that academic development staff, which include writing tutors, have to acknowledge the need to identify theoretical and analytical lenses outside the global norm. They state, it is time for us to seek new theoretical and analytical lenses and to develop our own theories appropriate for the global South. What is valuable about this, which I think also we were guided by Professor Albert Weideman, who is considered the father of applied linguistics in South Africa. And what he said very early on is that if we do not theoretically underpin our designs, we will fall victim to theoretical fashions. And I think we would have seen some of that in the early Writing Center history. What I find valuable about this particular research is that as many Writing Center coordinators and directors do, we often share texts with our consultants to read before, during, and after the training. This particular text becomes one of the seminal texts we ask our consultants to read. This theoretical framework will contribute to building a shared language for talking about Writing Center work. Drawing on multiple approaches in a single tutoring session and understanding students' historical and theoretical backgrounds are often necessary for effective writing tutoring, and effective tutor training should include an overview of what has been given in this particular article. You'll also notice that in much of the conclusion, where we talk about the implications of tutor training, we offer a summarized table or framework, because we acknowledge too that as much as we want to socialize our consultants into the literature on writing centers, they are themselves engaged in their own postgraduate studies. And so succinct tables that capture effectively much of what we need them to know is some of what we offer. So this particular article concludes with a table that looks at the approaches to teaching writing, the beliefs about writing, the role of the center, the role of the tutor, and the tutoring strategies that align with each of these approaches. So consultants can read about a variety of approaches spanning 60 to 70 years in a snapshot. And as much as I write about tutor training in the South African context, I believe that this, like a few other tables in what we offer, is applicable to any writing center anywhere in the world. And of course, as you know, we would start off from the current traditional approach, and we end up with social constructivism, which is familiar to all of us who work in writing centers, and then of course the social literate and the social political approaches. The second topic is the tutoring session. We simply call it the stages of a consultation. Ironically, we haven't actually conducted context-specific research on this aspect, but we've used our existing video recorded research to guide our practices here. So we can watch a video, look at the way an experienced consultant carries out a consultation, and share that with newer consultants. It's also been very meaningful or valuable to compare the different openings and closings, the way different consultants do it. So although we haven't written about it, existing research has informed our practice there. The third topic focuses on the writing process, which I think is the key to what we do in the Writing Center. And interestingly, this research was actually written before the establishment of the Writing Center. What this research does is it uses a pre-test, post-test approach to determine whether the one-on-one support provided to students while they write the post-test assignment actually makes a difference. Our findings showed that there was improvement in the writing of the introduction, and there was improvement in the writing of the conclusion. but there was limited improvement in the writing of the body part of an essay. But as writing teachers, we understand that. It is in the writing of the body of the essay that students have to engage in the higher order concerns, the paragraph construction, the paraphrasing, the synthesizing, the stance and engagement. But what is valuable about this research, number 3, published in 2016, what is valuable about this research is it confirms the value and effect of one-on-one support, and it also indicates to us what are the areas for student development. The 4th topic is something that I think used to be a burning topic in writing center research, the directive, non-directive debate. And I struggled with that for a long time until I realized that the best way to solve that problem was to actually conduct research on it and actually find out what is needed for our particular students. So we believe that our methodology used in that particular research can help train writing tutors so that they can understand not only the characteristics that make a tutorial successful, but also how to use and analyze a variety of tutoring methods and techniques. Because I think that the term used in the literature is flexibility, that our consultants should aim to be flexible. When I started off this research, my greatest fear was that I would find that my tutors were purely directive and I would be fired as the writing center coordinator. And I'm glad that we tried out that video research because yes, my consultants were very much directive and I still have the job at the writing center. We concluded from our research that directive tutoring can and does stimulate learning and interactive discussion with undergraduate first-time visitors to a writing center. And directive tutoring did not take ownership of the text out of the student's hands. Despite the seemingly directive actions of the tutor, a close analysis of the talk revealed that they were not doing the work for the student, but through a series of actions, explained concepts, they equip students with the knowledge and skills necessary to complete the task. And despite the teacherly role assumed by the tutor, they appear to succeed in stimulating the students' thinking about writing. And there is no indication, at least in the research we've conducted, that the student was voiceless or powerless, as would have been the case if the tutor had been undemocratic or prescriptive. So that research is also quite valuable in our training. The 5th topic is something that I particularly enjoyed writing about, and that is the roles, the tutor roles. And I think we would know that the tutor roles are very closely aligned to the strategies that the tutor will adopt during a writing center consultation. Ryan Zimmerelli and especially Harris have written about this. What is interesting is what Tona says. She says if tutors are themselves unaware of the roles they adopt during consulting, it might be advisable that such roles, as identified in the literature, as well as the ones we've exported in the study, be introduced to tutors during their training. And what we do is we share a table as one possible way to apply the roles identified here. Now, with regard to the research we've conducted on roles, I always use the word playful when I talk about the research by Rambiritch and Drennan. It was written during COVID, and I had the data, and I was very interested in the roles that tutors assumed, and we exploited the hero's journey metaphor with a focus on Vogler's mentor roles. And we were able to look at the different roles that our tutors adopted, and they were wonderful roles. They were planters and they were gift givers, all taken from the hero's journey metaphor. And this is the table we can provide at the end, which explains the teacher role, the function of the teacher role, and the considerations for the writing tutor. So once again, as a snapshot, they will be able to understand the different roles. Now, I must say that with research like the roles of a tutor or humor that I will talk about in a few minutes, as much as it is valuable to introduce them to tutors and to consultants, it's important to remember that each consultant's consulting strategy is also influenced by their personality and who they are. It's not in my vocabulary to use metaphors as much as one of my consultants did. It's my responsibility to share as much as possible with my consultants, but it's their responsibility to adopt what comes naturally to them. So really it is about sharing with them, allowing them to understand it, allowing them to have access to what to do and how to do it, but the actual use should be natural on the part of the consultants. Topic 6 focuses on the functions, purposes, and strategies of tutor training. Instruction, suggestion, explanation, those are aspects we've looked at when we looked at directive tutoring, and that was published in that earlier article. But under that, we've included questioning as a tutoring strategy. You know, I myself, as I'm sure other writing center coordinators, when we steered away from non-directive tutoring, we also believe that we need to steer away from that level of questioning. But despite the fact that we're not purely non-directive during our consultations, the questioning is still an important part of what we do. And so we were very excited to have a master's student who wrote her master's thesis on providing a framework for questioning strategy during writing center consultations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The second aspect we focused on there was the role of praise as an effective strategy. I think that we tend to focus so much on the cognitive elements during a consultation and the teaching of writing and the sharing of writing, that I think we need to also remind ourselves that the affective element is what keeps the student coming back to the writing center. It is about the engagement that happens between that consultant and student, and I was very interested in that. In our video research, we found that when we coded our literature, our data, we found that the praise statements had the highest number of statements, more than any other statement in our data. And I was very interested in determining understanding a little bit more about the praise statements. So we wrote up about praise as an effective strategy. And interestingly, we found that in other research, motivation was more commonly used, or concern was more commonly used, yet praise was more commonly used in our context. And I think that points to the need for context-specific research. So under that research role of praise, we can share with students a number of effective strategies, such as praise, motivation, and solidarity. And I must admit that solidarity is one of my most favorite strategies that my consultants use. And then, of course, the last research under functions and purposes of tutor training is humor in writing center consultations. So I grew up in a home where my mom taught us that laughter is the best medicine. So humor is very important to me. And I was very interested in determining whether this was happening during writing center consultations. I think it was wonderfully valuable literature because it shared with us that there is positive humor and there is negative humor. And it gave us the opportunity to open my consultants up to this. And what was really valuable about this research is all of the humor in the data that we collected was directed at the writing. So it wasn't humor taking place outside of the conversation, which means that our consultants were using humor to teach different principles of writing or to talk about the text. This is the table that our master's student created when she wrote about a framework for questioning strategy. And this is another framework that I think is not just valuable in my writing center. What she's done is she will give us the question type, the function of the question, when to use the question. So that it hopes happen at the beginning of the consultation, later on in the consultation, an example of how to use the question and how the question promotes student learning and engagement, because that's really what we want at the end. Then, of course, with regards to personal and contextual factors, and we picked this up once again from the international guides, we've done very little research on this aspect. The only area where we've actually conducted research is on the multilingual writer that I've spoken about earlier on during my presentation. I'm confident that we will get to all of the different aspects, but I think at present what we're trying to do is to master what we do. But that would be other areas that would basically be considered during your tutor training. Then, of course, writing across the curriculum and the different writing genres is not something we specifically focused on in terms of research, but there are definitely aspects that we cover during our training. With regards to higher and lower order concerns and what are higher and lower order concerns, we've covered that in a very interesting chapter in the book that we've written. What was wonderful about that was it was a chapter written in English and then translated into Afrikaans. So it was wonderful for me to, as a monolingual, to see my research in another language. I think what is also valuable about that research is that it has been published in a textbook for honors and master's students in applied linguistics. We do not have many students as many as you have here, focusing on writing, focusing on the writing center. So having a chapter in a book that provides students with everything that they need to know about writing centers might open up the possibility to more postgraduate students focusing on the work that we do in the writing center. And in that particular chapter, we've really given an overview to the history of the South African Writing Center and all the different aspects that I've been able to cover today. The last aspect in red, under a higher and lower order concerns, is the question of should grammar be taught, and if so, how? And it's not something I've written about yet, but like many other researchers, I have a title in my head, something like to grammar or not to grammar. So I'm really hoping that we're going to be able to write about that during our multilingual research. Is our research going to align with the myths in writing center literature that all multilingual students want to start off their consultation with grammar? We're going to investigate that. I already have a feeling that that's not going to be so from our earlier video research, but let's not preempt our research. So that's definitely something we're going to be writing about later on. And then with regards to feedback, which is actually the basis of what we do in the Writing Center, we actually wrote about that quite late. We wrote about that during COVID when we had migrated online, and there was definitely a need for more asynchronous consultations in our Writing Center. And I think that was motivated by the data and connectivity issues our students have. So there was a greater uptake for asynchronous consultations. And so my research partner and I were keen to determine how best to support our students. How do you give feedback during asynchronous Writing Center consultations? And what was valuable about that is this research compiles a descriptive diagram of good practices that can be used to train consultants to enhance the quality of the feedback that they give to students. And I will share that diagram with you in a minute. And then, of course, one of the other bits of research we wrote during COVID pertains to social justice. I was curious to know whether some of the social justice principles that were very present during face-to-face consultations, were they transferred to the online realm? And I must admit that it was very disappointing to find that we still have a long road to travel as we transform our Writing Center, that I need to open up many more opportunities for discussions around social justice. We need to have many more difficult conversations in our Writing Center as we transform. But I think that that's the value of research. It's not there just to confirm that you're doing what you should be doing. It's there to tell you what you need to do better. And so, of course, we hope to open up during our consultant training and during our meetings more discussions in the hope that such openness will instill in our consultants the confidence to address and approach such issues, irrespective of where the consultation or the conversation happens. The last topic here are the practical issues, and I think that happens in all of the guides. It's not something I plan to write on. I think it's very context specific. But in a nutshell, those would be the main areas or the main topics or aspects that one would look at as you start setting up a Writing Center. This is the diagrammatic representation of feedback. It is drawn from the literature on feedback as well as a focus group discussion with our consultants. But if you look at the diagrammatic representation and you look at what it's asking you to do with feedback, it's not something that is relevant only to asynchronous Writing Center consultations. It is definitely something, if tweaked a bit, can be used during face-to-face consultations. I think as a writing teacher myself, I've had to remind myself that my feedback needs to be layered. So my students know what the problem is, why it is a problem, and how to correct the problem. But I also need to constantly remind myself that there are strengths to any student's writing, that we focus on the positive as well as the negative. So this diagrammatic representation would be very valuable for teaching consultants about the feedback. And colleagues, what I present is what I like to call a living outline for tutor training. This is what it looks like at present, and you will notice that the bracket there and the feedback at the end, although it came later on, I think it speaks to everything we do in the Writing Center. This is the framework that's going to evolve and it's going to expand as we add to it the research from the multilingual research project. I know as well the focus in this framework is very much on the students, but I do know that there is a lot of space in this framework for research on our consultants. I know that there's a colleague of mine at another writing center in South Africa who's written about consultants as emerging academics. And I know that there's research about how being a writing center consultant improves the writing of the consultant themselves. And I think definitely in a framework like this, there is space for much more research. So writing center research, practice, and by extension tutor training should ideally be interwoven. And such training practices emerging from our research praxis is by no means rigid or absolute. Instead, we see such training practices as fluid, changing, and yielding to the needs of a student body constantly in flux. We acknowledge too that the design and implementation of such practices should not be done in isolation or in a vacuum. Our hope is to continuously hold our practices up to critique and comment. As I draw to a close, I remind you of my initial aim in this presentation: to move beyond the lamentations of our daily struggles by foregrounding the resilience, flexibility, and commitment that South African writing centers demonstrate. I hope that I have not disappointed. The transformation and evolution of the writing center are no doubt inevitable and necessary. The support we provide, the training we offer, and the conversations we have within and outside the confines of the writing center must align with this transformation and evolution. Our responsibility in the writing center has shifted too, from a focus on academic success only to a focus on the development of and respect for the uniqueness that each student brings to our space. As a last and final point, I cannot help but draw your attention to a recurring metaphor used in a soon-to-be-published collection of writing center research. This interests me because writing center practitioners have long theorized and metaphored the space of the writing center. We have seen its evolution from labs, clinics, to consulting rooms and fix-it shops, garrets, storehouses, and parlors, to contact zones, Parisian cafes, homes, and liminal and transformative spaces, and more recently, as a global village. Contributors in this soon-to-be-published volume offer a new and equally provocative metaphor: the writing center as a possible ecological community. Vivian's likens it to a greenhouse, Nichols to an ecosystem, and Rambiritch and Drennan to consultants as planters. It is a metaphor that conjures up images of life, growth, and interaction, but that of threats and dangers too. It might not be a metaphor we choose to adopt, but what it illuminates is the potential our writing centers have to grow and to develop and to transform and to reimagine in sunlight, but in darkness too. As we continue our journey to transforming and reimagining our writing center, we carry with us the burden of the past and the future of our students. For what is a writing center, if not a place crafted from the mistakes of yesterday and the dreams of tomorrow? Thank you.
Thank you so very much. That was amazing. We're gonna give the floor to people in the room first to ask questions, and then we're gonna go online. So if you're online, you can type your question in the Q&A section, or you can raise your hand and be allowed to speak. So anybody in the room have a comment, question?
Hi, I'm Monique. I work in the Writing Center as our new research manager, and I'm also an applied linguist by trade. A lot of my work has been involved with teaching English for academic purposes in international contexts. And so some of the research designs that you talked about very much align with L2 writing research, also applied linguistics. I just wanted to ask, from these research frameworks that you're looking at or designs, which kind of field of study have you found that you're tending to draw on for these skills acquisitions?
Okay, so I do not have an applied linguistic background, and I struggle with that a lot. Like many other writing center coordinators and directors, we've come through a difficult path, and my background is in literature, South African literature. My PhD jumped to applied linguistics, and I learned a lot about statistical analyses of language tests, and that was a test for me. So I'm learning as I go. I was very lucky to have been mentored by my research partner, who's now retired, unfortunately, who is a linguist and then also an applied linguist. And so I've really been guided by her. So I cannot say that there's any particular school of thought that I align with. I do a lot of reading, and I have to then create a typology from what I've read to determine what will underpin my research. And I struggle.
That's great. Thank you.
My name is Zinja Mabato. I'm from Durban, South Africa. Mine is not really a question. It's maybe a gesture of gratitude in terms of your presentation, simply because I come from the School of Education from UKZN. My first master's degree was on literacy practices of English second language as a student at University of Technology. Then I was still at DUT. So I really liked your presentation, particularly because my advisor, Professor Smith, and myself were discussing what I would love to pursue in terms of my thesis next year, where I'll be focusing on how the writing center, for instance, will influence students' writing practices, particularly focusing on multilingual students. So I really appreciate this presentation. It actually speaks what I'm about.
Wonderful. And I would be happy to share. I'm no expert, but I have a lot of literature on multilingualism in the South African context. I would be happy to share with you and Professor Smith.
Thank you very much for the
Hi, Josh, we met. Thank you for your presentation. First of all, there's lots to chew on about here that I'm really excited about. I'm particularly interested in hoping you could maybe speak a little bit more about there's a slide a while back where we were talking about the conclusions you drew from your observations about directive practices. And I'm very curious about kind of like if you could speak more about just like what you found, like how you were analyzing the research that you found, like to make the to draw the conclusion that like these directive practices were not actually like taking away agency from these writers, because I started my tutoring and tutoring very much in like the era where that debate was raging like very fiercely, and it's always in my mind, and I'm so curious to see or hear a little bit more about what you found, what questions you asked, how you came to that those conclusions.
All right, so I hope I can answer that question. That was research was a while ago.
Sorry.
It's fine. I think we need to think about the context that these consultations happen in. Many of our students come from a disparate education system, unequal education system. And we also know that the exit level examination at the end of what we call the matric year, before they enter first year high school, doesn't prepare them for the reading and writing that we engage in. Many of our students do not get any academic literacy or any academic writing support. So the first time they get any real advice or teaching happens sometimes during that writing center consultation. And if I think about my consultant who wrote up the chapter on metaphors, and she's one of my most seasoned consultants, and I've learned so much from her, and Grace has met her as well. She will often start off in a very engaging way. And she will look at the introduction, for example, and she will have a highlighter, and she will ask the student to highlight parts of the introduction. And when she picks up that the elements of the introduction are not there, she sits back and then she will say, do you know anything about, do you know what we do here? Do you know anything about the introduction? And when the student says, do you know what elements should be in the introduction? What follows that is an element of teaching. And our video recorded consultation shows that although the student might be silent, the gestures tell us that the student is engaged in that consultation. Also remember that based on the same research, we wrote about humor. that humor would not have been present if there was no level of engagement happening. What is also very interesting is that in many of the consultations, after the consultation had been concluded, and you can see it on the video, the student gets up and he or she's packing up their bags, and it's really time to say goodbye, and the student opens up a whole new channel of conversation. I have a video where the student says, you know, my consultant has said goodbye and please come back if you have time before you submit your assignment. And the student opens up and says, I hate this kind of writing. And what started up was, you know, the student talking about the fact that she loves poetry and she loves creative writing, and she's really struggling with the kind of writing she needs to engage in. That level of engagement would not happen if the student did not feel affirmed in some way during that consultation. Josh, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
So hi, I'm Shannon. Hi, so I don't know, it's totally okay if you don't have an answer to this, because I know that this might not have been a specific thing that you maybe put your time into since you've been building on this area of research, but I know that you mentioned that you wanted to implement more conversations more frequently about social justice with your consultants. I was just wondering if you had any like initial ideas on what those implementations would look like, or any ideas around that.
Right. So after that particular research that will be published soon, it was also during COVID. We used our learning management system, and my consultants and I had a conversation about rewriting our mission, which at that point had been close to 8 years old. And I think the agency of the consultants, having the voices of the consultants, was one opportunity for dialogue. So that was one of the things we did. In one of the responses to that particular research, in response to one of the questions, one of my consultants' statement read, he or she wrote, something about needing to make sure that our consultants are not bigots. That's a worrying statement for me as a writing center coordinator. And I have not gotten to those conversations because we hit the ground running after COVID, but those are some of the conversations I think we need to open up and we need to. Thank you.
We don't have any question online, so feel free to type your questions or raise your hands if you want to ask a question or say a comment.
Let me ask another logistical question. So in the research that you've been doing at your center, it sounds like a lot of it is on the practice that is currently happening in the writing center. When you are doing these observations or video recordings, is that under the umbrella of using that information for research purposes just in operations use, or do you go through an IRB with your institution? How does that work?
So we cannot do any research at our institution without ethical clearance, is what we call it. It's pretty difficult to get ethical clearance. It's a long process, so you need to plan well in advance. It can delay your research if you don't plan well. And especially in cases where it's video recorded research and there's the possibility that we may use stills from the videos, we need to make sure that faces are pixelated and that needs to be indicated in the ethical clearance. So absolutely, I've had to go through a process for ethical clearance, and no data collection can start before full ethical clearance has been granted. And it includes everything from an ethical clearance to a survey form to a letter of consent for students. It must be, and for consultants, the letter of consent must be filled out before the video actually begins. And that's really quite difficult, because if the letter of consent has to be filled out, and I've got a video room that's separate to the writing center. So sometimes what I see on the video is not what I should be seeing, because the whole welcoming and the hello and the who are you has happened while they were filling out the letter of consent in the writing center before they moved to the video room and started the video. So it's a little bit complicated, but yes, all of that, absolutely all of that needs to be done. In the letter of consent, we also indicate to the student, my cell phone number will be there, my email address will be there, my office number will be there. And we are obligated to indicate to the student that they can withdraw from the research at any point. And if they withdraw, their data is being destroyed, or whatever the case may be. And that if they continue with the research, that it's of no harm to them, there's no negative impact. And they can have access to anything we've written up about them. They can have access to it or see it, peruse it before we actually publish it. We also have to store the research for close to 30 years, store the data in some kind of universal repository for a long time.
Thank you.
So, is there a question online? There is. Let's see if they have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, so we are sorry, we're having some technical difficulties. That's why you're not able to see the speaker, but hopefully you are able to hear her. So that's why it's not working. The video is not working. That's why you cannot see her. So they want to see you.
I guess you could turn on the video
We
on
can-
your computer.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
not one for like.
So this one doesn't have, okay.
Voice.
So I think the voice is more important. You want to hear. Okay, so my question was, in your presentation, you focus on the specificity of the African context. So I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit about your partnership with the MSU Writing Center, like what does that bring into your center?
Look, as I said in my paper, it's wonderful to understand what happens in multiple contexts. Some of what we do might be quite similar. And I think that's what the partnership is about. It's about us learning from each other. I'm really interested in the consultant training, which I know MSU does extensively. And so that's what I'm interested in. And I know that MSU is also doing some multilingual work, and they're probably interested in the multilingual research that we've conducted. So really, I would think that partnership is a lot about a give and take regarding our shared practices.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Avasha, for your wonderful lecture. Just giving us all so much to think about. I observe when I'm in the writing center, I see humor happen, right? I see it in tables and in conversations, and I'd love to hear in a more formal sense how that came through your research, how you have tried to see humor happening. I mean, I've seen it, observed it, but what is the research about humor in writing center?
Okay, so this is where you will know that I'm not an applied linguist. So what we used for that research was a politeness lens. So we used the positive politeness and the negative politeness, and you will help me if I confuse the two, which I probably would. So we used the politeness lens to look at the humor. We also looked at the definition of humor and the 3 different kinds of humor. And we found that students used humor positively if they wanted to praise a student, for example. But if there was a situation where they had to correct a student's writing and they wanted to soften that, then they would use humor, for example. I mean, I know that one of my consultants, the consultant I've spoken about, at some point, right at the beginning of the consultation, she says to the student, why did you come to the writing center? How can I help you with it? And she bangs the table and she says, because you have to come. And then the student, they laugh about something like that. Or there's an incident, except in the literature, in our data collection, where the consultant shares in jest about how the writing center saved her marriage. So she says, I came to university and I got 5 out of 10 for a summary, and this is what happened, and I came to the writing center and the writing center saved my marriage. But it's little instances like that, which although she's an older consultant, there's a level of solidarity. So there were various instances where humor was used to teach writing, humor was used to praise the student. Grace, I think I'm not answering your question, because I can't think, but I have the research with me, but I have to share.
Thank you.
But there were multiple examples of things. There was one example where the consultant talks about a run-on sentence. And she says your sentence should not be a run on sentence. And until that point, the student had been very quiet, there'd been no response from the student. What we did in that research was we did not look only at laughter, which is what Tolas did. We looked at humor, so the actual speaking aspect of the humor, and then the possible laughter that followed. There was another excerpt where the student uses a particular word, and the tutor says she uses the word dodgy to talk about the student's use of the word. Now, I know it's not a positive word. It might not be a positive word if a 50-something-year-old like myself said that to a student, but the word dodgy from student to student could have a more humorous. So there were a number of examples in that way.
So if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank everybody, starting with our very wonderful guest today, Dr. Rambiritch. I'm terrible with names, I'm sorry. So thank you very much. We are very delighted, and sorry for our participant online. We're sorry that you are not able to see our guest speaker, and hopefully next time it will work better. And thank you for everybody for coming and for listening and for your questions. We appreciate you. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.